Sheffield sits at the northern tip of the M1. To the south, the motorway runs straight into the East Midlands, through Derbyshire, into Staffordshire, beyond. To the north, it connects to West Yorkshire, to Leeds, to the wider arterial network that links the major cities of the north of England. That geography is not incidental to what this video covers. It is the reason two separate criminal networks, built years apart, chose Sheffield as their operational base. Both used those road corridors as supply routes, built wholesale cocaine and firearms distribution chains that stretched across multiple counties. Both were eventually dismantled by multi-agency agent investigations that took years to complete and produced sentences totaling hundreds of years in combined custody. One network put 20 guns onto Sheffield streets alongside 75 kilograms of controlled substances. The other pushed cocaine 60 miles south from Wincobank into Burton-upon-Trent through a wholesale chain that generated six-figure monthly turnover at its southern end. Today we are covering both. Section 1, Sheffield, the networks, and the streets that built them. Sheffield is a city of two halves in almost every sense. To the west, the hills rise sharply through Hallam and Stannington, past Victorian terraces and into open moorland. To the east and north, the city flattens into former steel districts, post-industrial estates, and dense residential streets that stretch through Wincobank, Burngreave, and out toward Rotherham. For decades, those eastern corridors carried the weight of Sheffield's economic decline, and, alongside it, the slow consolidation of organised criminal activity. That would eventually draw the attention of some of the largest law enforcement operations in the region's history. This video covers two of those operations. They are separated by several years, but connected by geography, by method, cod, and by the kind of network logic that tends to repeat itself in cities with established supply routes and a steady demand for controlled substances. First is the network built and run by Mohammed Arsalan Hussein from his address on Westview Lane in Sheffield, criminal enterprise that stretched across the Yorkshire and Humber region and into the West Midlands, supplying cocaine, crack cocaine, cannabis, DA mare, firearms and ammunition, on a scale that investigators described as one of the largest operations in the regional organised crime unit's history. The second is a wholesale cocaine chain anchored in Sheffield and Barnsley, run through the supply relationship between Daniel Karim of Wincobank Close and Jacob Fieldsend, formerly of New Chapel Street in Barnsley, a network that pushed controlled substances south and east, through Rotherham, Derbyshire, and into Burton-upon-Trent, before the East Midlands Special Operations Unit dismantled it and put 16 of its members behind bars for a combined total of 150 years. Between them, these two networks account for more than 265 years of custodial sentences handed down at courts across the country. They account for over 20 seized firearms, more than 84 kilograms of controlled substances taken off the streets, and well over £370 Walser in cash recovered by investigators. They account for dozens of arrests, multiple trials across several jurisdictions, and years of covert surveillance work conducted by officers from the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit, South Yorkshire Police, the National Crime Agency, and the East Midlands Special Operations Unit. What connects them is simpler than the operational detail. Both networks were built in Sheffield. Both used the city's road and transport links as the arteries of a supply chain that ran in multiple directions. Both were layered operations with a principal figure at the top, a tier of wholesale distributors beneath, further tier of street-level sellers below that. Both were dismantled not by a single arrest or a lucky traffic stop, by sustained investigative work that lasted years and drew on resources from multiple agencies working in coordination. Winkerbank sits in Sheffield's northeast, a neighbourhood that borders Burngreave and looks out toward the Don Valley. Westview Lane, Mohammed Arsalan Hussein lived, is a few miles southwest, in a part of the city closer to the centre. Abbeydale Road, where Mohammed Noor lived as a senior figure in the Hussein network, runs south from the city into the Derbyshire direction. The addresses map a particular geography of the operation, a network that radiated outward from Sheffield along the same corridors that connect the city to the rest of Yorkshire, to the Midlands and beyond. The Kareem and Fieldsend network used similar geography. Kareem operated out of Winkerbank, Fieldsend operated from Barnsley, a town 12 miles north of Sheffield that sits on the M1 and functions as a transit point for supply chains running in both directions. The network pushed cocaine south through Chesterfield and into Derbyshire, further south, still into Burton upon Trent in Staffordshire. That southern reach is significant. Burton is more than 60 miles from Sheffield, running a wholesale cocaine supply chain that far down the motorway corridor, maintaining discipline across that distance, keeping the supply consistent enough that customers like Brandon Thompson of Hazelwell Avenue in Burton were spending 6 figures a month on the product. Requires organisation. Trust. It requires the kind of operational structure that does not come together by accident. The Hussein network and the Karim Fieldsend network had that structure. Both had survived long enough to establish themselves as serious operations before law enforcement moved against them. And both, when they were eventually dismantled, left behind a case record, detailed enough to fill court proceedings across multiple venues and generate sentencing remarks that describe the scale of harm caused to communities across South Yorkshire and beyond. Detective Inspector Lee, senior investigating officer for the EMSU case, put it plainly when the sentences for the Karim Fieldsend network were handed down in October 2002-5. The harm caused by people who supply controlled substances to communities, he said, cannot be underestimated. The network had not only flooded areas of Derbyshire and Staffordshire with cocaine, members had driven dangerously and without licenses when trying to evade capture. Weapons had been recovered. Additional convictions for firearms offences had been handed to 2 of the most senior members of the group. DCI Andy Howard, senior investigating officer for the Roku's case against Hussein, had said something similar when those sentences were handed down in January 2021. Officers from the Roku, South Yorkshire, and the NCA, he said, had spent more than 2 years tracking members of the network. A lot of the work he noted, had been carried out behind the scenes. People may not have known those officers were working, but they were. That is the shape of this video. 2 networks, 2 investigations, 2 sets of sentences that together add up to more time behind bars than most people will spend in an entire working life. Sheffield is where both stories begin, and Sheffield is where both stories end. Behind the first of those networks, and the scale of what they built across Yorkshire and the Humber, is where we start. Section 2, the Hussein Empire. Guns, drugs, and a network across Yorkshire. The investigation into Mohammed Arsalan Hussein began in February 2019. At that point, Hussein was 28 years old and living on Westview Lane in Sheffield. What investigators from the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit started building from that opening surveillance work was, the following 2 years, revealed to be one of the most expansive criminal networks to have operated out of the city in modern times. The network was not limited to controlled substances. It was not limited to a single type of drug. and it was not limited to Sheffield or even to Yorkshire. Sheffield Crown Court later heard the full picture. Hussein had positioned himself at the head of a criminal organisation involved in the large-scale supply of illegal controlled substances, firearms and ammunition, as well as the movement of cash across a significant geographic footprint. The network extended across all of the Yorkshire and Humber region and reached into the West Midlands. That reach matters. Means that Hussein's operation was not a localised distribution network moving product around a few Sheffield postcodes. It was a supply infrastructure that connected multiple cities, multiple regions, multiple tiers of criminal activity into a single operation run from Westview Lane. The controlled substances side of the network covered multiple categories. Officers from the ROCU recovered 9 kilograms of high-purity cocaine and crack cocaine as part of the operation. Beyond that, they recovered more than 70 kilograms of Class B controlled substances, including over 6 kilograms of skunk cannabis. And then there were the MDA tablets, 50,000 of them, seized during the course of the investigation. Put those figures together, and you are looking at a supply operation that was not servicing a single market or a single type of customer. This was a diversified network. Cocaine and crack cocaine for one tier of distribution, cannabis for another, MDMA moving alongside both. The ability to supply across those categories simultaneously points to connections with multiple sources, multiple couriers, a logistics operation that had been functioning long enough to establish consistent supply lines. Firearms dimension of the network placed it in a different category from drug-only operations. When officers moved against Hussein and his associates, they recovered 20 guns. DCI Howard described them specifically as guns that, once seized, could no longer be used to cause violence in the communities they served. Among those weapons were submachine guns. Alongside the firearms came ammunition. The presence of weapons at that level is not incidental to the operation. Firearms in a network of this scale serve specific functions: enforcing debt collection, deterring rival operations, protecting supply routes and key personnel. The 20 guns recovered in this case tell you something about the kind of environment Hussein had built around himself and the people who worked with him. Mohammed Noor, 35, of Abbeydale Road, Sheffield, was one of the senior figures in the network. He would ultimately receive a sentence of 10.5 years. Derek Woods, 41, of Blakeridge Lane in Batley, West Yorkshire, was another significant figure, sentenced to 14 years. Jack Stretton, 23, of Manor Farm Drive in Leeds, also received 14 years. The geographic spread of those 3 addresses alone gives you a sense of how far the network reached. Abbeydale Road is in Sheffield, Blakeridge Lane is in West Yorkshire, Manor Farm Drive is in Leeds. The operation had senior personnel distributed across the region, not concentrated in a single location. Beneath those figures, the network extended further. Aqib Hussein, 25, of Napier Street in Sheffield, was involved and would receive 7.5 years. Sajid Fiaz, 35, of Midhill Road, Sheffield, played a role that would bring him a 7-year sentence. Leon Waite, 22, of Denholm Close, Sheffield, and Rodney Bruce, 20, of Otley Walk, Sheffield, were both sentenced to 6 years. Nashad Khan, 21, of Cromford Street, Sheffield, also received 6 years. Hamza Mohammed, 20, Staniforth Road, Sheffield, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Sheffield addresses stack up across the network's lower and middle tiers: Napier Street, Holmhurst Way, Otley Walk, Staniforth Road, Cromford Street, Birch House Avenue. These are streets across different parts of the city, from Ortybridge in the northwest to Staniforth in the east. a footprint that reflects how embedded the network was across Sheffield's residential geography. Daryl Wilson, 51, of Oaksfold Avenue in Sheffield, was among the older figures in the network, sentenced to 4.5 years. Ethan Hallows, 20, of Stannington Road, Sheffield, received 3 years. Derice Cohen, 19, of Birch House Avenue in Ortybridge, was sentenced to 4 years. Luke Padley, 29, of No Fixed Abode, received 4.5 years. Total across all 15 members came to 115 years. The investigation that produced those sentences had begun in February 2019 and concluded with final sentencing hearings in January 2021. That is nearly 2 years of sustained investigative work across 3 agencies, the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit as the lead, South Yorkshire Police in operational partnership, and the National Crime Agency providing specialist support. DCI Howard described it as an investigation on a massive scale. The court record supports that description. The cash recovered during the operation came to £250,000. That figure represents what was seized. It does not represent the total volume of money that moved through the network during its operation. How the network was tracked saw how investigators built the case that eventually brought each of those 15 men into court, and what the evidence revealed about the day-to-day mechanics of running a firearms and drug supply operation across an entire region is where the next section picks up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the evidence trail looked like from the inside, and how 20 guns ended up in the hands of investigators, comes next. Section 3. 20 guns and the men who moved them. 20 guns is not an abstraction. To put that number in perspective, a single illegal firearm recovered in a police operation is treated as a significant result. A single submachine gun found in a residential property generates its own press release, its own charging decision, its own weight in court. The Hussein network was not carrying one firearm or two. Officers recovered 20, alongside the ammunition required to use them. Volume of weaponry does not accumulate by accident. It is sourced, transported, stored, distributed through a deliberate logistics chain that runs parallel to the drug supply operation and requires many of the same skills: trusted personnel, secure storage locations, reliable movement between addresses, principal figure confident enough in the structure around him to keep that level of hardware in circulation. Submachine guns recovered during the operation placed the Hussein network at the serious end of the firearms supply spectrum. Submachine guns are not improvised weapons. They are not converted blank firers purchased cheaply from an online marketplace. They represent a connection to supply chains that operate at a level above street-level criminality, chains that bring military-grade or near-military-grade hardware into the UK and distribute it through networks that know how to handle the operational security risks that come with moving that kind of material. The presence of that category of weapon in the Hussein network tells you something specific about the level at which Hussein and his senior associates were operating. The men who moved through this network came from across the city and the wider region. Leon Waite, 22, of Denholme Close in Sheffield, sentenced to 6 years. Rodney Bruce, 20, of Otley Walk in Sheffield, received the same. Nashad Khan, 21, of Cromford Street, also received 6 years. These were young men, some of them still teenagers, when the network was at its most active, drawn into a structure that gave them roles, income, and status inside an operation that was, from the outside, largely invisible. The addresses these men came from are ordinary Sheffield streets: Denholme Close, Otley Walk, Cromford Street, Staniforth Road, where Hamza Mohammed, 20, lived before he was sentenced to 5 years. Birch House Avenue in Ottibridge, the address of Derice Cohen, 19, who received 4 years. Ottibridge is a village on the northern edge of Sheffield, a place most people associate with the Loxley Valley and the countryside beyond it. Birch House Avenue sits within a residential estate that looks out over the hills. The fact that a 19-year-old from that address ended up inside a network handling submachine guns and 50,000 MDMA tablets is a detail court record registers but does not explain. The network reached into parts of Sheffield that are not typically associated with organised crime, which is precisely the kind of geographic spread that makes a large-scale operation harder to track and easier to sustain. Sajid Fiaz, 35, Midhill Road in Sheffield, received a 7-year sentence for his role. Daryl Wilson, 51, of Oaks Fold Avenue, sentenced to 4.5 years. The oldest figure in the network by some distance. The age range across the 15 men sentenced runs from 19 to 51, a spread that reflects the different layers of the operation. Younger men in movement and distribution roles. More experienced figures in positions that required either established connections or the kind of criminal record that comes from years of involvement in organised activity. Luke Padley, 29, of No Fixed Abode, received 4.5 years. The absence of a fixed address for Padley is itself a detail worth noting. People who operate inside networks that require operational security sometimes move deliberately between addresses, avoiding the kind of fixed residential footprint that makes surveillance straightforward. Whether that applies to Padley specifically, court record does not say. What it does say is that he was a participant in the network and that he was sentenced alongside 14 others, who, between them, represented a cross-section of Sheffield and the surrounding region. The £250, zero in cash, recovered during the operation was physical money. Notes seized from addresses, from vehicles, from persons detained during the investigation. Cash at that volume is both a record and a liability. It has to be stored somewhere. It has to be moved. It generates questions when it appears in bank accounts. The Hussein network, like most serious organised crime operations, had to manage the proceeds of its activity as a logistical problem in its own right, separate from the problem of moving controlled substances and firearms. How effectively it managed that problem across a 2-year period before investigators caught up with it is part of what made the case complex to build. What the ROCU, South Yorkshire Police, and the National Crime Agency built across those 2 years was a case detailed enough to sustain multiple trials at courts across the country. Each of the 15 defendants was eventually brought before a court. Each was convicted. Each was sentenced. The investigation that produced that outcome began in a specific way, with a specific decision to start looking at a specific individual on Westview Lane in February 2019, and it unfolded from that starting point across 2 years of work that, as DCI Howard noted, was largely invisible to the public at the time it was happening. How that investigation developed from its opening surveillance phase into a full, multi-agency operation that ultimately seized 20 guns, 75 kilograms of controlled substances, and £250,000 in cash is what the next section lays out, Section 4. How the ROCU took the empire apart February 2019 is when the investigation formally began. Officers from the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit had identified Mohammed Arslan Hussein as a subject of interest and started building the intelligence picture that would eventually grow into one of the largest operations in the ROCU's history. At that stage, the investigation was surveillance-led. Officers were watching. gathering, mapping the movement of people, vehicles, communications across a network that had not yet been fully defined. What made the Hussein investigation complex from the outset was not simply the geographic scale of the operation. It was the combination of criminal activity running through a single network simultaneously. Controlled substances of multiple categories, firearms and ammunition, cash being moved across the region. A principal figure who was connected to associates spread across Sheffield, West Yorkshire and the West Midlands. Building a prosecutable case against a network of that breadth requires patience, and it requires the kind of institutional coordination that does not happen automatically between agencies with different mandates, different resource pools, and different operational priorities. The partnership between the ROCU South Yorkshire Police and the National Crime Agency was what made that coordination possible. The ROCU, as the lead agency, had the specialist organised crime intelligence capability. South Yorkshire Police had the local knowledge, the existing intelligence on Sheffield-based criminality, and the operational capacity to conduct warrant executions and arrests across the city. The NCA brought specialist investigative capability around serious and organised crime at the national level, including the kind of surveillance and intelligence tools that a regional force alone would not have access to. DC Dave Clarkson, the officer in charge of the case from the ROCU, described the investigation as having disrupted an organised crime group that had, over the years, affected communities in Sheffield and other areas of the UK. That phrase, over the years, is significant. It suggests that the Hussein network had not simply appeared in 2019 when investigators started watching it. It had been operating for a period of time before the formal investigation began. The two-year investigation was not building a case against something new. It was catching up with something established, covert surveillance. Across a network of that scale means tracking the movement of multiple individuals across multiple locations over an extended period. It means building enough evidence on each figure to justify arrest and charge, not simply on the most visible participants, but on the full structure of the network, from Hussein at the top, through to the younger men who handled delivery and distribution at the lower levels. Nashad Khan, 21, of Cromford Street, Hamza Mohammed, 20, of Staniforth Road, Derice Cohen, 19, of Birch House Avenue. Each of those convictions required its own evidentiary thread running back through the investigation. The NCA's Director of Investigations, Nikki Holland, spoke at the time of sentencing about the connection between firearms and controlled substance supply. That the case illustrated so clearly. Firearms and drugs go hand in hand, she said. They are used by organised crime groups to coerce, intimidate, and commit serious violence. Pressing their availability is a priority for the NCA. The 20 guns recovered during the Hussein investigation represented 20 firearms that could no longer serve those functions in the communities of South Yorkshire and beyond. The arrests, when they came, were spread across the timeline of the investigation rather than concentrated in a single action day. Multiple trials followed at courts across the country, reflecting the fact that different defendants chose different legal strategies, and that the case had to be prosecuted in stages rather than as a single block. That complexity is itself a feature of taking down a large network rather than a small operation. The more people involved, the more moving parts in the prosecution phase. By January 2021, the final sentences had been handed down. Mohammed Arsalan Hussein stood in Sheffield Crown Court and received a total sentence of 27.5 years. 15 members of his network had, between accumulated 115 years of custodial time. DCI Howard described it as a major victory in the fight against serious and organised crime in Yorkshire and beyond. The officers involved, he said, had been working behind the scenes for years in ways the public would not have seen. The sentences were the visible result of that invisible work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The man who received 27.5 years, his background, his address on Westview Lane, and what the court record reveals about how he built and ran a network that stretched from Sheffield to the West Midlands is where the next section begins. Section 5. Muhammad Arsalan Hussain. The man at the centre Westview Lane is a residential street in Sheffield. It sits in the southwestern part of the city, a few miles from the centre, in an area that transitions between older terrace housing and the kind of quieter suburban streets that would not, to a casual observer, suggest anything unusual about the people living there. Muhammad Arsalan Hussain was 28 years old when the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit began watching him in February 2019. By the time he stood in Sheffield Crown Court to receive his sentence, he was 30. 2 years between those 2 points had been, for investigators, a sustained effort to map and document an operation that proved far larger than starting point had suggested. Sheffield Crown Court heard that Hussain was the head of a criminal network involved in the large-scale supply of illegal controlled substances, firearms, and ammunition, and the movement of cash across a significant regional footprint. That description carries several distinct elements, and each one matters. Large-scale supply is not the same as street-level dealing. Hussain was not a man standing on a corner with product in his pocket. He was operating at the level where multi-kilogram quantities of cocaine and crack cocaine move through a supply chain, where connections to firearms sources allow 20 guns to enter and circulate within a network, and where 50,000 MDMA tablets can be held and distributed without any single seizure collapsing the whole operation. The network extended across all of the Yorkshire and Humber region and into the West Midlands. For a man of 30, that geographic reach represents something that does not build itself overnight. Supply networks of that scale require established relationships, sources of controlled substances, with people who can move firearms, distributors and handlers spread across a wide area, who are trusted enough to be given product or hardware, and reliable enough to return money. The chain. Those relationships take time to build and require a track record of reliability that precedes the period when investigators started watching. DCI Andy Howard, the senior investigating officer for the case, described what his team had found in specific terms. 9 kilograms of high-purity cocaine and crack cocaine, more than 70 kilograms of Class B controlled substances, including over 6 kilograms of skunk cannabis, 50,000 MDMA tablets, 20 guns, among them submachine guns, ammunition, £250,000 in cash. The phrase he used about the firearms was precise. Guns that could no longer be used to cause violence in the communities they served. That framing reflects the operational reality of what those weapons represented in the environment where the Hussain network was active. Firearms in a drug supply operation of that scale are not decorative. They are functional. Their presence in the network in the volume recovered indicates that violence, or the credible threat of it, was a structural feature of how Hussain's organisation maintained itself. Personnel beneath him reflected a network that had drawn people in from across the city and the wider region. Mohammed Noor, 35, Abbeydale Road, was a senior associate who received 10.5 years. Derek Woods, 41, of Blakeridge Lane in Batley was another significant figure who received 14 years. Jack Stretton, 23, of Manor Farm Drive in Leeds also received 14 years. Keeb Hussain, 25, of Napier Street in Sheffield was connected to the network and received 7.5 years. These were not peripheral figures. They were the structural layer that sat beneath Hussain at the top and above the younger men who handled movement and distribution further down, the younger members. Many of them Sheffield residents in their late teens and early 20s, formed the operational base of the network. Rodney Bruce, 20, of Otley Walk, Nashod Khan, 21, of Cromford Street, Hamza Mohammed, 20, of Staniforth Road, Derice Cohen, 19, Birch House Avenue in Ortybridge, Ethan Hallows, 20, of Stannington Road, Leon Waite, 22, of Denholm Close. These men were recruited into a structure that already existed, given roles within it, and were exposed to the legal consequences of those roles when the operation eventually moved against the network as a whole. Hussain himself, 30, was not a significantly older figure than the men around him. What separated him from the others in the network was not age but position. He was the connective tissue between the supply sources and the distribution layer, the person through whom firearms moved as well as controlled substances, the person whose address on Westview Lane sat at the centre of what DCI Howard called a criminal empire. That word, empire, tends to get used loosely in crime reporting. In this case, the court record gives it some substance. Network spanning Yorkshire and the West Midlands. 20 guns, 75 kilograms of controlled substances in multiple categories, £250,000 in recovered cash. For a man who was 28 when investigators began watching him, the scale of what Hussain had built was the defining fact of the case. DC Dave Clarkson, the officer in charge from the ROCU, noted that the network had over the years affected communities in Sheffield and other areas of the UK. The investigation that ultimately dismantled it required 2 years of sustained, largely invisible work from 3 agencies. The sentences that followed required multiple trials at courts across the country. And the man at the centre of all of it, Mohammed Arsalan Hussain of Westview Lane, Sheffield, received 27.5 years. The full sentencing breakdown for every member of the Hussain network, every name, every address, every term handed down across those multiple court hearings, is where the next section takes you. Section 6, 115 years. Full sentencing of the Hussain Network Sheffield Crown Court. On the day of Mohammed Arsalan Hussain's sentencing was the end point of a process that had begun in February 2019 and wound through nearly 2 years of surveillance, intelligence work, arrests, trials at courts across the country. By the time the final sentences were handed down in January 2021, 15 men had been brought before the courts and convicted of offences connected to the Hussain network. The combined total of their sentences came to 115 years. What follows is the full record. Mohammed Arsalan Hussain, 30, of Westview Lane, Sheffield, the principal figure. Sheffield Crown Court heard that he had been the head of a criminal organisation involved in the large-scale supply of controlled substances, firearms and ammunition, and the movement of cash across the Yorkshire and Humber region and into the West Midlands. He was sentenced to a total of 27.5 years. That sentence places him among the most seriously sentenced figures in South Yorkshire's organised crime history over the past decade. 27.5 years is not a term that comes from peripheral involvement. It reflects the court's assessment of his role as the organising intelligence behind an operation of significant scale and significant harm. Derek Woods, 41, of Blakeridge Lane, Batley, West Yorkshire, received 14 years. Woods was one of the senior figures in the network, and his sentence reflects the level of his involvement in an operation that reached across Yorkshire into the West Midlands. The Batley address places him at the northern edge of the network's geographic footprint, detail that reinforces how far the Hussein organisation extended beyond Sheffield itself. Jack Stretton, 23, of Manor Farm Drive, Leeds, also received 14 years. Stretton was among the younger figures to receive a sentence at the top of the network's range, and his Leeds address, like Wood's Batley connection, underlines the fact that this was a regional operation rather than a city-contained one. Leeds and Batley are both within the Yorkshire and Humber footprint that investigators had described from the outset of the case. Mohammed Noor, 35, Abbeydale Road, Sheffield, was sentenced to 10.5 years. Abbeydale Road runs south from Sheffield city centre in the direction of the Derbyshire boundary, a long arterial road that passes through several distinct residential areas before reaching the city limits. Noor was among the senior Sheffield-based figures in the network, beneath Hussein himself, and his sentence reflects that position. Shazad Hassan, 23, Holmhurst Way, Sheffield, received 15 months. The significant difference between Hassan's sentence and those of others in the network reflects a difference in the level and nature of his involvement as established during the court proceedings. Sajid Fiaz, 35, of Midhill Road, Sheffield, was sentenced to 7 years. Aqib Hussain, 25, of Napier Street, Sheffield, received 7.5 years. Both men were Sheffield-based members of the network, whose sentences sit in the middle range of the full sentencing spread, reflecting roles that were meaningful within the structure without being at the level of the principal figures. Leon Waite, 22, of Denholm Close, Sheffield, was sentenced to 6 years. Rodney Bruce, 20, of Otley Walk, Sheffield, also received 6 years. Nashod Khan, 21, of Cromford Street, Sheffield, was sentenced to 6 years. 3 young men from Sheffield addresses, each receiving the same term, Pchi, representing a tier of the network that handled operational activity at a level below the senior distributors, but above the most junior participants. Hamza Mohammed, 20, of Staniforth Road, Sheffield, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Darrell Wilson, 51, of Oaksfold Avenue, Sheffield, received 4.5 years. Luke Padley, 29, of No Fixed Abode, also received 4.5 years. Derice Cohen, 19, Birch House Avenue, Autobridge, was sentenced to 4 years. Ethan Hallows, 20, of Stannington Road, Sheffield, received 3 years imprisonment. Across those 15 sentences, the picture that emerges is of a network with genuine depth. Post from Hussein at 27.5 years, down through Woods and Stretton at 14, Noor at 10.5, Fiaz and Aqib Hussein in the 7-year range, down through the 6-year sentences for Waite, Bruce and Khan, and further still to the 3 years received by the youngest participants. The spread reflects a court's assessment of a tiered criminal organisation, each tier carrying its own level of culpability, each level receiving a sentence calibrated to that culpability. DCI Howard summarised the outcome in terms of what it meant for the communities the network had been operating in. This investigation, he said, had disrupted an organised crime group that had over the years affected communities in Sheffield and other areas of the UK. Supplying firearms, ammunition and controlled substances of all categories has serious negative impacts on communities and public services. The sentences, he said, were intended to send a message to people involved in, or considering becoming involved in, the supply of substances and firearms. Nikki Holland of the National Crime Agency was direct about what the firearms seizure represented: 20 guns that could no longer be used to coerce, intimidate, or commit serious violence. Firearms and drugs going hand in hand, as she put it, is not a coincidence. It is a structural feature of serious organised crime at the level the Hussein network was operating. Pressing the availability of both was, she said, a priority for the NCA and remained so beyond the conclusion of this particular case. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Several years after the Hussein network was dismantled and its members were in custody, a different kind of operation was taking shape in Sheffield. Its principals were younger. Its focus was cocaine wholesale rather than the full spectrum of supply that Hussein had run. But the structure, the logic, and the eventual outcome followed a pattern that will be familiar from everything covered so far. That network, and the man at its Sheffield end, is where the next section begins. Section 7. A new network, the same streets, Kareem, Fieldsend, and the cocaine chain Wincobank Close, is a residential address in the northeast of Sheffield. The neighbourhood sits between Burngreave and the lower Don Valley, an area that borders some of the city's most historically industrial terrain, former steelworks, cleared sites, and the kind of dense residential streets that have absorbed successive waves of Sheffield's working population across different generations. Daniel Kareem, 35, lived on Wincobank Close. From that address, he operated as a cocaine supplier at a level that placed him at the top of a wholesale chain stretching south through Rotherham and Derbyshire and into Staffordshire. When the East Midlands Special Operations Unit eventually built its case against the network, Kareem's address would appear in the court record as the origin point of multiple significant cocaine seizures, product that investigators recovered from Jacob Fieldsend's possession in August 2023, and from Jordan Green's possession around the same period, traced back to Kareem. Both seizures, 4 kilograms from Fieldsend and 2 kilograms from Green, were linked directly to the Wincobank Close address. Jacob Fieldsend, 27, formerly of New Chapel Street in Barnsley, principal distributor beneath Kareem in the network structure. Barnsley sits 12 miles north of Sheffield on the M1 corridor, position that makes it a natural waypoint for supply chains running between West Yorkshire and the East Midlands. New Chapel Street is a residential address in the town centre area. From there, Fieldsend ran what the court record describes as 2 distinct streams of business simultaneously. The first was wholesale supply, selling cocaine in kilogram or part kilogram quantities to other distributors who would then move it further down the chain. The second was operational control of a number of drug lines running through Chesterfield and Sheffield, lines that reached end users through a further layer of street-level sellers beneath Fieldsend's own tier. That dual function is worth understanding clearly. Fieldsend was not simply a middleman passing product along a single chain. He was running his own distribution infrastructure at the same time as supplying other independent networks. The customers he supplied at the wholesale level, Jordan Green, Daniel Hicklin, and Brandon Thompson, were not working for Fieldsend. They were buying from him and operating their own networks beneath. That structure, principal wholesaler, supplying multiple independent downstream operations, is harder to map and harder to prosecute than a single linear chain. Each of those downstream operations has its own personnel, its own geography, its own financial flows. Connecting all of them back to a single supplier requires building multiple evidentiary threads simultaneously. Jordan Green, 25, an address in Amber Valley, Derbyshire, was one of those wholesale customers. Green was not simply buying cocaine from Fieldsend and selling it on quietly. He was running his own drug lines, employing Benjamin Matthews and Stacey Jones to sell cocaine to users on his behalf. When investigators arrested Green, they found 2 kilograms of cocaine in his possession. That quantity at the point of arrest is a wholesale amount. Green was not carrying personal use quantities or even modest street-level stock. He was holding product at the volume consistent with his role as a mid-tier distributor in his own right. Brandon Thompson, 26, Hazelwell Avenue in Burton, upon Trent, Staffordshire, was another customer of FieldSend's. Thompson's operation extended the network's geographic reach to over 60 miles south of Sheffield, pushing the Karim FieldSend supply chain into territory that sits well outside South Yorkshire's immediate orbit. Burton-upon-Trent is a market town in the Staffordshire lowlands, more than 60 miles from Winkerbank, close by road. Thompson was buying large quantities of cocaine from FieldSend and selling them on to others further. Down the chain in the Burton area means the network's footprint covered a corridor from Sheffield south through Chesterfield and Derbyshire and into Staffordshire, a supply route of significant length maintained across a sustained period. Daniel Hicklin, 37, of Michaelwood Way in Bolsover, Derbyshire, the third major wholesale customer identified in the case. Bolsover sits roughly midway between Sheffield and Nottingham, a former mining town in northeast Derbyshire. Hicklin's address and his roles in the network place him squarely in the Derbyshire section of the supply corridor that FieldSend was running southward from his Barnsley base. Joel Herritt, 26, of Skipsea Road in Sheffield, the figure who worked most closely with FieldSend in managing the network's operations. Herritt was not simply a distributor. His eventual sentence of 23 years and 8 months, matching FieldSend's own term, reflected both his cocaine conspiracy involvement and separate convictions relating to a series of firearms discharges in 2022. Firearms offences place Herritt in a category that connects the Karim FieldSend network, primarily a cocaine supply operation, to the same world of weapons and violence that had defined the Hussein network years earlier. Firearms discharges in 2022 were not abstract criminal history. They were events that happened in Sheffield streets, and they happened in the context of the same criminal environment that the cocaine supply chain was operating within. Karim himself, when arrested, found to be in possession of £11,000 worth of trainers. That detail appears in the court record alongside the cocaine seizures and the cash recoveries, and it points to the same pattern visible in serious, organised crime operations across the country. High-value goods acquired through the proceeds of supply activity, spending that is visible, physical and trackable. The moment the East Midlands Special Operations Unit began closing in on this network, the specific arrests that cracked the supply chain open and the evidence that connected Karim in Winkerbank to Thompson in Burton 60 miles to the south, is where the next section picks up, Section 8. How EMSA broke the supply chain August 2023 is when the first significant physical evidence appeared. Officers from the East Midlands Special Operations Unit moved against Jacob FieldSend, 27, formerly of New Chapel Street in Barnsley, and when they arrested him, they found him in possession of 4 kilograms of cocaine. 4 kilograms is a substantial wholesale quantity. Street-level purity and pricing, 4 kilograms of cocaine represents a significant sum in retail value. The wholesale level at which FieldSend was operating, buying in bulk from Karim in Winkerbank, and selling on in kilogram or part kilogram lots to Green, Hicklin, Thompson and others. That quantity reflects a single transaction, or the consolidation of stock ahead of a series of distributions. FieldSend was not caught with residue or personal amounts. He was caught holding product at the level consistent with his role as a major wholesale distributor. The link between that seizure and Daniel Karim was established through the investigation. 4 kilograms found with Fieldsend were connected to Karim at Wincobank Close. That connection placed Karim as the source of supply to Fieldsend and positioned him at the top of the chain that MSU was mapping. Around the same time, Jordan Green, 25, of Amber Valley, was arrested and found to be carrying 2 kilograms of cocaine. That seizure was also linked back to Karim. 2 separate wholesale customers, arrested within the same investigative operation, carrying product that traced to the same Sheffield address. For MSU, 2 threads converging on Wincobank Close built the evidential foundation that placed Karim at the apex of the supply chain. Daniel Karim, 35, found in possession of £11,000 worth of trainers when he was arrested. That detail sits alongside the cocaine seizures and the cash recoveries in the court record as part of the picture of how the network operated and how its proceeds were being used. High-value goods, particularly clothing and footwear at the premium end of the market, are a recurring feature in the financial landscape of serious organised crime cases. They are purchased with cash, they retain some of their value, and they are the kind of asset that appears in a warrant search, without generating the immediate questions that a box of banknotes would. Karim's £11 zero in trainers was not the largest single asset recovery in this case, but it was among the most telling details in terms of what it revealed about how the proceeds of the supply chain were being spent at its top tier. October 2023 brought the arrest of Brandon Thompson, 26, Hazelwell Avenue in Burton-upon-Trent. Thompson was stopped by police and found to be in possession of just under 1/4 kilogram of cocaine. That quantity on its own would have told one story. What the investigation found beyond that initial stop told a considerably larger one. On Thompson's mobile phone showed him communicating with customers and, in those communications, making specific claims about the scale of his purchasing. Thompson told customers he was spending 6 figures worth of money each month on cocaine to sell on. 6 figures a month. That is not the language of a small-scale street dealer. That is the financial footprint of a mid-tier distributor running a substantial operation in the Burton area, sourcing product at volume from Fieldsend's wholesale network and turning it over at a rate that generated monthly expenditure in excess of £100,000. When officers searched Thompson's property following his arrest, they found a box containing £67,000 in cash. They also found a number of weapons, cash and the weapons, at the same location as a man whose phone showed him discussing 6-figure monthly cocaine expenditure, gave investigators a picture of how Thompson's Burton operation was structured and what it looked like from the inside. Cash retained on premises at that level suggests either that Thompson was holding proceeds ahead of moving them up the chain to Fieldsend, or that he was managing his own working capital outside any banking infrastructure. The weapons at the same address placed his operation in the same category as the Hussein network had occupied years earlier, a supply network that kept hardware close because the environment it operated in made that a rational choice. Harry Chapman, 30, Mason Drive in Rotherham, was another figure brought into the investigative frame during this period, sentenced to 7 years and 6 months for his involvement in the conspiracy. Aaron Megson Willis, 35, of Thorntree Road in Rotherham, received 10 years and 5 months and also admitted a separate offence of being concerned in the supply of Class A controlled substances. Rotherham addresses in the case extend the network's geographic footprint north of Sheffield, completing a picture of an operation that ran from Winkerbank in Sheffield's northeast through Rotherham, south through Chesterfield, Bolsover, Amber Valley, and all the way down to Burton-upon-Trent in Staffordshire. The East Midlands Special Operations Unit, as the lead investigative agency, built this case from the physical evidence of those arrests and the digital evidence recovered from Thompson's mobile phone outward through the network. More than 9 kilograms of cocaine was ultimately seized across the operation as a whole. Over £120 seared in cash was recovered. Weapons including a taser and imitation firearms were seized. High-value vehicles, jewellery, designer clothing were taken as part of the asset recovery. Detective Inspector Lee, the senior investigating officer, noted after sentencing that the operation's harm extended beyond the supply of controlled substances alone. Members of the network had driven dangerously and without licenses when attempting to evade capture, with no consideration for other road users. Violence that goes hand in hand with drug supply, as he put it, was evidenced not only in the weapons recovered, but in the additional firearms, convictions attached to the sentences of both Fieldsend and Herrett for the 2022 discharges. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full sentencing chain for the 16 members of the Kareem Fieldsend network, every name, every address, every term handed down across the courts, is where the next section takes you. Section 9, Raids, Seizures, First Wave of Sentences. By the time the East Midlands Special Operations Unit had worked through the arrest of Jacob Fieldsend in August 2023, the arrest of Jordan Green around the same period, and the stop of Brandon Thompson in October 2023, the structural shape of the Kareem Fieldsend network was clear on paper. The task that followed was prosecuting it, turning surveillance intelligence, physical seizures, and digital evidence into convictions across a network of 16 people, spread from Sheffield down through Rotherham, Derbyshire, and into Staffordshire, is not a process that moves quickly. It requires charging decisions, court listings, guilty pleas, trials, pre-sentence reports, and sentencing hearings that, in a case of this complexity, will run across multiple venues and multiple dates. When the final sentences were handed down in October 2025, the case had moved through that entire process. 16 members of the network were convicted. 150 years of custodial sentences were handed down in total. Physical evidence recovered across the operation set the factual foundation for those convictions. More than 9 kilograms of cocaine was seized. That figure represents product recovered at different points in the investigation. From Fieldsend's 4 kilograms at arrest, Green's 2 kilograms, Thompson's quarter kilo, and further seizures across the network as EMSO worked through the wider membership. Over £120, zero in cash, was recovered across the operation. Weapons were seized, including a taser and imitation firearms. High-value vehicles were taken. Jewellery and designer clothing were recovered as part of the asset seizure work that runs alongside drug supply prosecutions at this level. Kareem's £11,000 in trainers sat within that broader picture of asset recovery, one line in a longer inventory of goods purchased through the proceeds of cocaine supply. The sentencing of the network's broader membership, figures below Kareem, Fieldsend, and Herrett at the top, reflected the layered structure of the operation and the different levels of culpability established during the court proceedings. What follows is the full record of those sentences. Jordan Green, 25, of an address in Amber Valley, Derbyshire, was sentenced to 9 years and 8 months. Green had been found with 2 kilograms of cocaine at arrest, product linked directly to Kareem at Wincobank Close. Beyond that seizure, the investigation established that Green was running his own drug lines, employing 2 further individuals to sell cocaine to users on his behalf. His sentence reflects both the volume of product he was handling and the organisational role he had assumed within the network's distribution layer. Brandon Thompson, 26, of Hazelwell Avenue, Burton-upon-Trent, received 9 years. Thompson's arrest in October 2023, the quarter kilo on his person, the £67,000 in cash and weapons found at his property, and the mobile phone evidence showing him telling customers he was spending 6 figures a month on cocaine, together built a picture of a distributor operating at serious volume in the Burton area. His sentence sits alongside Green's as one of the heavier terms handed to the network's mid-tier members. Luke Phipp, 26, of Branston Road, Burton-upon-Trent, was sentenced to 9 years. Phipp's presence in the case alongside Thompson, both from Burton addresses, reflects the fact that the network's southernmost operational point had more than one active figure working within it. 2 men from the same Staffordshire town receiving the same sentence indicates the depth of the distribution structure that had been established in Burton area through Fieldsend's supply chain. Aaron Megson Willis, 35, of Thorntree Road, Rotherham, received 10 years and 5 months. Megson Willis also admitted a separate offence of being concerned in the supply of class, a controlled substances alongside the main conspiracy charge, and that additional admission is reflected in the length of his term. His Rotherham address places him in the northern section of the network's corridor between Sheffield and the Derbyshire stretch of the supply route. Harry Chapman, 30, of Mason Drive, Rotherham, sentenced to 7 years and 6 months. Chapman's role in the conspiracy and his Rotherham base connect him to the same part of the network as Megson Willis, a distribution presence northeast of Sheffield that helped the operation maintain coverage across South Yorkshire as well as the southern Derbyshire corridor. Daniel Hicklin, 37, of Michaelwood Way, Bolsover, received 6 years and 5 months. Hicklin was one of the substantial wholesale customers buying from Fieldsend, his Bolsover address in northeast Derbyshire, placing him mid-corridor between Sheffield and the network's southernmost reach in Staffordshire. His sentence reflects a distributor operating at meaningful volume within the chain. Alex West, 29, of a northeast Derbyshire address, sentenced to 6 years and 3 months. West's involvement in the conspiracy and his Derbyshire base extend the picture of how comprehensively Carriff Fieldsend network had penetrated the county south of Sheffield, with multiple figures operating across different Derbyshire postcodes simultaneously. Cameron Turner, 22, of Sheepcote Road, Killamarsh, received 4 years and 11 months. Turner also admitted conspiracy to acquire, use, or possess criminal property alongside the supply offence, and that additional admission is reflected in his sentence. Killamarsh sits on the South Yorkshire and Derbyshire boundary, small town on the eastern edge of the Sheffield conurbation, and Turner's presence in the case at that address illustrates how the network operated right at Sheffield's own borders as well as deep into Derbyshire. Michael Hall, 36, of no fixed address, was sentenced to 4 years and 10 months. Christopher Hall, 39, of Holme Road, Chesterfield, received 4 years and 6 months. The Hall brothers were dealers supplied by Fieldsend, selling cocaine directly to users. Christopher Hall's Chesterfield address places him in one of the key towns in the network's middle section, town that featured explicitly in the court record as one of the areas where Fieldsend was operating drug lines. Benjamin Matthews, 31, Circular Drive, Renishaw, was sentenced to 4 years. Matthews had been employed by Jordan Green to sell cocaine to users on Green's behalf, role that placed him in the lower distribution tier of a network that was itself downstream from Fieldsend. Renishaw is a village in the Bolsover district of Derbyshire, a few miles from Chesterfield. Matthews' address places him in the same geographic cluster as several other members of the network's Derbyshire-based distribution layer. Stacey Jones, 35, of Nelson Street, Chesterfield, received 4 years. Jones, like Matthews, had been employed by Green to sell cocaine directly to users. 2 individuals recruited by a mid-tier distributor to handle street-level sales, both receiving 4-year sentences, reflects the court's consistent approach to that tier of the operation across the sentencing exercise. Jake Barnsley, 24, of Haxby Place, Sheffield, was sentenced to 7 years and 2 months. Barnsley's Sheffield address and his position in the sentencing record place him within the network's Sheffield-based operational layer, distinct from the Derbyshire and Staffordshire distribution arms, but connected to the same supply running out of Kareem's Winco Bank Close dress. Latrell Walker, 18, of Stony Bank Drive, Rotherham, was the youngest member of the network to appear in the proceedings. Walker received a 2-year community order for his involvement at a disposal that reflects of both his age and the level of his participation in the conspiracy as established during the court process. Detective Inspector Lee, the senior investigating officer from EMSA, addressed the full scope of the harm the network had caused when the sentences were handed down, the impact of the group's activities on the community, he said, extended far beyond the supply of controlled substances alone. The operation had seen members drive dangerously or without licenses when trying to evade capture, with no consideration for other road users. The fact that weapons had been recovered and that additional firearms and convictions had been attached to the sentences of both Herritt and Fieldsend for the 2022 discharges demonstrated the violence that goes hand in hand with drug supply at this level. Harm caused to communities by people who supply controlled substances, he said, cannot be underestimated. The 2 figures whose sentences closed the Kareem Fieldsend case, and what both Sheffield networks taken together prove about the shape of serious, organised crime in this city, is where the final section takes you. Section 10, Kareem Fieldsend, and what both networks prove Sheffield Crown Court in October 2025 was the final setting for the Kareem Fieldsend case. Broader membership of the network had already been sentenced. What remained were the 3 figures whose roles sat at or nearest the top of the operation. Joel Herritt, 26, of Skipsey Road in Sheffield, received 23 years and 8 months. That sentence carried 2 distinct elements. Cocaine conspiracy conviction accounted for 1 part. A separate set of convictions relating to a series of firearms discharges in 2022 accounted for the rest. Herritt's sentence is the clearest single illustration in the Kareem Fieldsend case of the connection between drug supply at that level, violence that surrounds it. The firearms discharges in 2022 were not historical events unrelated to the network's cocaine activity. They were events that occurred in Sheffield streets during the period when the supply chain was active, the same criminal environment that the cocaine operation was embedded within. Jacob Fieldsend, 27, formerly of New Chapel Street in Barnsley, received 23 years and 8 months. Like Herritt, Fieldsend's sentence included both the cocaine conspiracy and convictions related to the 22 firearms discharges. Fieldsend had been the structural centre of the distribution network beneath Kareem, running wholesale supply to multiple independent downstream operations while simultaneously controlling drug lines through Chesterfield and Sheffield. When officers arrested him in August 2023, the 4 kilograms of cocaine found in his possession was the physical anchor of the case against him, court record built around that arrest, and around the broader investigation that connected his supply activity to Kareem in Wincobank, to Green in Amber Valley, to Thompson in Burton, to Hicklin in Bolsover, and to the Hall brothers in Chesterfield, produced a sentence that reflects the full weight of what he had built and sustained across the network's operational period. Daniel Kareem, 35, Wincobank Close in Sheffield, received 19 years and 8 months. Kareem's sentence also carried a second element, cocaine conspiracy in South Yorkshire, distinct from the main MSU case, reflecting the fact that his supply activity extended beyond the specific network that investigators had mapped and prosecuted. 19 years and 8 months for a man of 35 means Kareem will not leave custody until he is well into his 50s. The 11 pounds Zielser trainers found at his arrest, the cocaine linked to him through both Fieldsend's 4 kilograms and Green's 2 kilograms, and the position he occupied at the top of a wholesale chain that reached 60 miles south of his Sheffield address. All feature in the court record produced that sentence. Together, Herriot, Fieldsend, and Kareem account for 67 years of the network's 150-year total. 3 sentences at the top of the case are longer individually than the combined terms received by several of the network's lower-tier members. That distribution reflects the tiered structure of both the operation and the prosecution, each level of the organisation receiving a sentence calibrated to its level of culpability and harm. Step back from the individuals and consider what both Sheffield networks, taken together across the span of years they cover, actually demonstrate. The Hussein network was dismantled in January 2021. After 2 years of investigation, beginning in February 2019, Karim Fieldsend network was dismantled in October 2025 after an investigation that produced its first significant arrests in August 2023. Between those 2 endpoints sits roughly 6 years. 2 separate operations, 2 separate sets of principal figures, 2 separate investigative teams from different agencies, operating under different mandates, and yet the structural logic of both networks is the same. Both were built around a principal figure in Sheffield, who occupied the top tier of a supply chain. Both extended their reach outward from Sheffield along road corridors that connect the city to the rest of Yorkshire, to Derbyshire, to the wider Midlands. Both incorporated firearms alongside controlled substance supply, either as a core element of the operation, as in Hussein's case, or as a feature of the criminal environment the network operated within, as in Fieldsend and Herriot's. Both were sustained across a significant period before investigators accumulated enough evidence to move against the full membership, and both ended in the same place. A courtroom, a sentencing judge, and a total that runs into hundreds of years of combined custody. The difference between the 2 networks is not one of kind. It is one of focus and scale. Hussein's operation was broader in its criminal scope, covering cocaine, crack cocaine, cannabis, MDMA, firearms, and ammunition simultaneously across the Yorkshire and Humber region and into the West Midlands. The Kareem Fieldsend network was more narrowly focused on cocaine wholesale, but it achieved significant geographic reach through the supply relationships. Fieldsend maintained with independent downstream operators in Derbyshire and Staffordshire. Hussein's network produced 115 years of sentences from 15 members. Karim Fieldsend network produced 150 years from 16. The numbers are different. The pattern is identical. both networks ultimately prove is that the geography of organised crime in Sheffield is not accidental. The city's position on the M1, its connections north to West Yorkshire and south into the East Midlands, internal residential geography, spread across distinct neighbourhoods from Winkerbank to Stannington to Abbeydale. All of it makes Sheffield a natural logistics hub for supply chains that need to move product across the north and Midlands of England. Investigators from the ROCU, South Yorkshire Police, the NCA and EMSU have each said versions of the same thing in the aftermath of these cases. Organised crime networks of this kind cause harm that extends far beyond the supply of controlled substances. They bring weapons into communities. They recruit young people into structures that will eventually bring those young people before a court. They generate violence as a management tool. The sentences handed down across both cases, 265 years in total, represent the court's response to that harm. They do not represent the end of organised crime activity in Sheffield. They represent the end of two specific networks, dismantled by sustained investigative work that most people never saw while it was happening. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.